Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. The motion for today's debate is: this House regrets the narrative that money cannot buy happiness. Representing the proposition team, we have team from England, and on the opposition, we have the team from Australia. From opposition side, our speakers are first speaker Ali, second speaker Maya, third speaker Jess, reply speaker Maya. On the opposition side, our speakers are first speaker Will, second speaker Alice, third speaker Michael, reply speaker Alice. Each speaker will have 8 minutes to deliver their speech. The first and last minute of each speech is considered protected time, during which points of information may not be offered. The judges will signal the end of protected time at the 1 minute mark, after which POIs can be offered, and will signal the return to protected time at the 7 minute mark. At the 8 minute mark, they will give a double clap or ding to signal the end of the speech. Additionally, there will be 3 claps or dings at 8:15, and the judges will stop listening at 8:30. Best of luck to both teams. I now hand over the floor to our chair judge.
Hello everybody, welcome to the Octofinals round of WSDC 2024. First and foremost, congratulations to both England and proposition and Australian opposition for making it this far in the tournament in what was indeed a very, very competitive WSDC, so please give a round of applause. For the panel of judges, I would be very honored to chair this round. I'm from Indonesia. He they pronouns specifically for me, but please do address the panel as a collective at all times, since this is a multi-person panel. So if you're going to invite the members of the panel, please introduce yourself.
Lauren from the US, she, her pronouns, excited for a great debate.
Hi, Edna from Croatia. We're going to great teams.
Wonderful. Just a number of reminders just to add to what Orban has mentioned previously. I'm sure that everyone is well aware of the timing regulations for WSDC at this point. It's 8-minute speeches for substantive and 4 for reply. I'm going to be using this timer. Oh, sorry. I hope that that is audible for everyone, so just make sure we use those markers to indicate POI starting time at 1 minute stop for 7, as well as for the double dings at which point the judges shall know technical notes. The other thing is with regards to just making sure that everyone is audible. If you'd like to do audibility check, because this room has a bit of an echo, you may do that as well. And we really would suggest everybody to ask POIs in the way that you face both the speakers as well as the audience at the same time, so horizontally across the stage, just to make sure everyone is can hear POI well. That would be really, really great. POI is a great sign of engagement as always. Finally, activating full screens, just make sure that speeches are, very respectful to any sort of groups that you may touch on tape, any arguments fair made. This is also a live streaming room, so you may want to take that into account as well when it comes to consent as well as anything else as well. If you'd like to read out that consent anytime within the debate, just let us know. Any questions before we start? Great. In that case, and once again, wishing everybody the very best of luck. Without further ado, I'd like to invite first
The narrative that money cannot buy happiness tells that young girl who was born into structural disadvantage that you may as well just give up. Because even if you improve your financial situation, if you don't have a stable family environment to share it with, you will never be happy. It's what justifies employers paying their workers the bare minimum, because the owners shift the individual to find their own happiness when money is seen as an irrelevant factor in that equation. For all of those reasons, we are incredibly proud to propose a few things in this speech then. Firstly, our stance on Team England, and then 2 arguments. Firstly, on why this narrative harms people on an individual level, and secondly, how it maintains inequality within society. 3 points to note in stance. 1, we regret the narrative that money cannot buy happiness. We think this narrative looks like presenting money as an impossible route to happiness, where we always encourage people to deprioritize the pursuit of money and prioritize other sources, such as time with family, such as time with friends, or such as like my interests or my hobbies. We think this often looks like encouraging people to settle. For example, young people being pushed into careers to help others because they're seeing that regardless of wealth, that's the way for you to make money. We think it also looks like the fact that people who are motivated by money, or who literally have to be motivated by money for obvious financial reasons, are demonized and seen as selfish people for not conforming to this narrative. Secondly, and this is really essential, we think fundamentally money does bring happiness in many situations. For example, if I'm stressed every day because I can't afford rent or I can't afford food, obviously I'm not going to be happy. But we also think it's a necessary prerequisite for any alternative sources of happiness that side opposition might tell you about. For example, it's hard for me to enjoy time with my family or friends if I can't pay to ever go out with them, or buy them things, or pay to have my hobbies and pay to maintain them. But crucially, it also insulates and helps people deal with stress, because not having money is often a significant causal factor of stress, also often a significant causal factor in things like domestic violence. But thirdly, and this is really crucial, opposition have to stand behind the idea that money can never buy happiness. That's the narrative they must present. Crucially, PROP can have a much more nuanced perspective. We can acknowledge that money affects individuals differently. For example, on our side, I can probably still decide that if more shifts lead to less family time and that makes me sad, I can probably still opt out of having those more shifts. Therefore, the difference occurs where I'm unsure what source of happiness will be best for me, or if I'm forced into believing that money is ultimately an illegitimate source of happiness. Establishing that, firstly, why does this narrative harm people on an individual level? There's 4 main reasons for this. Firstly, I just lack motivation at many points in life, because note that life is very, very hard. I'm constantly facing trials and tribulations. I'm constantly facing tests where I feel like things are hard for me. Therefore, we think there are significant pressure points in life where the rational want for money that I'm sure opposition will want to tell you about is overcome by external pressures. For example, if I want to get a promotion, but that promotion is very competitive, it's hard for me to motivate myself to get it if I don't believe that that extra money is going to bring me a lot of extra happiness. Or also, if money is less proximate to me. For example, if I'm at school, if I'm at university, I might not see that money straight away. Therefore, it's important for me to have an overarching narrative that ultimately that money can bring me happiness, to encourage me to keep going through trials, to keep going through tests. It's also important if I have, for example, a financially irresponsible partner, or I'm locked into a situation where I'm economically dependent on someone else, to have this narrative to recognise that ultimately money often should come prior, and it's something that I should always recognise. But secondly, know this is particularly important for social mobility, because firstly, for all the motivation that I've just told you about, I need a lot more of it if I'm structurally disadvantaged. If it's harder for me to go to school, if it's harder for me to get a job, I need that motivation, that end goal of money is ultimately going to be enough to outweigh the effort I have to put in to let myself to keep going. But secondly, and this is really crucial, know that other sources of happiness, for example, your family or your interests and your hobbies, often something that is ascribed to you and you don't have any power to change. For example, if I'm born into an unstable family or a family where there's presence of abuse, it's literally impossible for me to ever change that. So if opposition tells me that actually it's my family I should derive my happiness from, that's incredibly unmotivating, that's incredibly upsetting. Conversely, money is something that I can feasibly achieve, or even if it's harder for me to achieve, I can feasibly put in the effort to get it, instead of having to rely on things that are ascribed to me that I can fundamentally never change. I think we get so much more social mobility on our side of the house. But thirdly, we see more financial planning. Because note, when we see money as the unique route to happiness, I'm now proactively willing to maybe sacrifice my short-term happiness in order for long-term financial gain. And we think that's really essential sometimes, because yes, it might make me happy to go shopping with my friends, but if ultimately I'm probably going to be happier in the future if I'd saved that money to go towards my mortgage, we think that's a decision I might need help making. But finally, we just think it's an incredibly demeaning and condescending narrative. For example, if I'm a poorer person and my rich friends are telling me that, oh, don't worry, money doesn't buy happiness, just make the most of what you got, that's incredibly condescending and incredibly upsetting. But on the other side, if I've worked incredibly hard to gain money, to improve myself, to acquire wealth, if I'm now being told that that's not something I should care about, that that's not something impressive, that's also incredibly demeaning and condescending. The end impact of this argument is that on an individual level, this narrative is a necessary counterweight in order for us to make the best decisions, in order for us to achieve happiness. Please.
Is there a limit to how much more happiness you can get with each extra dollar? If there is, when does that occur?
Absolutely, and I think that's something that I can rationally weigh off for myself. As I said, if I recognise that taking this extra shift at work or doing this overtime is ultimately something that makes me feel sad because I don't see my family, presumably I should stop those shifts either way. But we have to recognise that for many people, that's just not a decision I have. I have to do those shifts. I have to earn that money because that's the only way for me to be financially viable. Those are the people you should care about, panel, not whoever Australia wants to talk about there. Secondly, how do we maintain inequality within wider society? There's three main reasons here. Firstly, it's much harder to push for a more equal system. We think essentially this creates a sense of false class consciousness when I'm encouraged to view money as something that I should not derive happiness from, and that I should derive happiness from me as an individual level to find happiness elsewhere. We think this affects firstly the level of companies and employers, because it's much easier for companies to underpay me to retain huge amounts of profits and not fairly redistribute them if money is seen as something that's ultimately not important, and if I'm seen as being able to derive happiness elsewhere. But secondly, on the level of governments, it's much harder to push for things that help stop inequality, things like redistributive taxes, things like subsidising education. If this is something that's seen that is not that important for me on an individual level. Conversely, when we recognise that money actually is totally necessary for happiness, it is much harder for the state or the private sector to not provide that because they're seen as doing me a fundamental disservice. But secondly, note that there are jobs with a social value that become significantly underpaid. This is really important. Oftentimes, service or public sector jobs, things like nursing, teaching and care homes, then this narrative means that I am told I am achieving my happiness through the task I am doing, through helping others, and that I'm achieving enough utility doing that, so therefore money is not a necessary motivating factor for me. This means that often these sectors are vastly underpraised and also are massively overrepresented by women, further creating inequality in society. Conversely, in absence of this narrative, we recognise that regardless if I gain utility from my work, I am still expected to earn money. I'm still expected to be adequately remunerated for that in a financial sense, because that is the only way that I can achieve true happiness. Finally, it just encourages much greater levels of community support, things like donating to charities, things like helping my friends out financially if they need it. When I understand that ultimately money is something necessary, money is something that I have to put before other considerations. Because inequality is maintained, because it stops individuals making rational decisions, we are so proud to propose.
You hear me all fine? Good. Unfortunately for side proposition, it was just true that money could not buy happiness. The communities with the highest levels of income often also had the highest rates of suicide in the world. These were places where people killed themselves because they felt relatively unequal to the people around them. They could never even get this happiness. What we would do on our side is say, no, you should not look at your relative inequality. You should not look at the money of the people around you. You should just try and find happiness in the family members that you're with. A couple things in this speech. Firstly, on some setup. Secondly, on explaining why lots of people can't change and therefore this narrative is good for them. And lastly, on why it's true that money cannot buy happiness and people are happier pursuing other things. So firstly, on some setup, we said there's an opportunity cost between doing things like your family and friends and pursuing things like money. The reason for this is first, you spend a lot of time working on stuff, and secondly, you feel tired when you come home, so you're unable to do both of these things. They tell you well, you can't pay for lots of these things as an opportunity cost if you don't earn enough money. We say the vast majority of people earn enough money to pay for some at least expenses. We also notice things like watching TV, like going to a park with your kids, things like having a nice conversation, a nice meal with them. Vast majority of these things are exceptionally cheap. No explanation as to why they need to be expensive. We can probably do them on our side. But the next thing to explain is that you already have a capitalist incentive to do lots of things they say. Getting out of absolute poverty, people were never affected by this narrative. They just didn't want to be living in destitute poverty. They were probably going to come out on either side. That stuff goes out of the way. But let's deal with a couple of the characterization issues that they give you that just kind of are unintuitive. They tell you, workers are more likely to be abused on our side. When there's a narrative that says money can buy you happiness, that's when you overwork your workers. It's when you do things like saying, oh yes, you can work a 14-hour shift and we'll pay you money. And in context where this happens, people often get paid the same amount of money they would have get paid for working 8 hours as they get for 14 hours because they lower the average wage, just work longer and get paid the same. Next thing they try to do is try and make it symmetry city by saying, oh, we'd make it happiness would be same on both sides. Note that it significantly increases the extent to which you need to pursue money for happiness. Obviously, you cannot be happy to the same extent on both sides by pursuing money. They are different things. People are more happy without money on our side. That out of the way, let's go and explain why some people cannot change on either side, and this narrative deprives these people of happiness. They explain there's lots of people in the world who are in structural inequality and cannot get out of it, but they never explain how these people have even bootstraps to pull themselves out of. They cannot. A couple of reasons why these people are unable to become wealthier. Firstly, it's out of your control because of the lottery of birth in 6 ways that this team never gets over. Firstly, it's things like when you go into the labour force, you're sometimes in economic decline, which means you get a foothold in that market, never get a job, you have a gap in your resume, no one will ever employ you. Secondly, it's things like racial inequality. I would say this team does not rectify this by getting rid of this narrative. Thirdly, things like geography. People born in India are just going to be poorer than people born in England. That is a harm that happens. Fourthly, it's things like your gender. There is a gender pay gap. It was not that women did not want to work hard enough to make money, there just was a gender pay gap that existed that could not be overcome. Fifthly, it's things like your government being ineffective, doing things like austerity policies which mean you don't get to access healthcare or don't get to access education levels to be able to improve yourself. And sixthly, it's things like having family privilege, things like a class system. All of these things are out of your control. You can never move out of it on their side. Second reason as to why some people cannot get wealthier is if you had a way to already do this, you probably would have done it if it was incredibly easy. It means that you have the things that they're talking about are where there are just massive trade-offs in your happiness. It means you probably have to do things like selling your organs to people because that is what means that you can get happiness. Do things like working 12 hours a day instead of 8 because it was easy for you to get this extra happiness through the money that they tell you or extra money. It's unclear why you wouldn't have done this anyway. It means there's probably a large delta in what that looks like. The third reason is that lots of this increase in money or wealth is just zero-sum or uncomparative. That is to say there's a finite amount of jobs and stuff. When one person gets a job in that income, the other person doesn't, so that excludes that person from that. Or corporations in the developed world, when they make money for their shareholders in the developed world, they often do it through exploiting the resources of developing countries, exploiting the labor of those people, which means those people get less happy, and they are not benefited through that. But even if it is not zero-sum, at least believing that some people who are wealthy in a community, when they see that their neighbor has a nicer car than them, they do not feel that they are wealthy, and therefore do not get the impact of that, so they never believe that they are wealthier. What are the impacts of this? It is given that some people cannot change, these people will often buy into the narrative we say on our side, because it will make them happier. It is the dominant narrative, these people will be better off. It means that things like when you're working class, you never had bootstraps to pull yourself up from. You never felt you had a choice to be able to access happiness on their side. Because they said happiness comes from wealth, you never felt you had the power to agency to be able to change this. You never felt that you even had a choice in your life about whether or not you could be happy. That was ridiculous. We should not let people believe that. If you think people have a right to happiness, you should be able to access that regardless of what you were born into on their side. Before I move on, I'll take a POI.
Families are inherently unstable, with 42% of marriages ending in divorce and often being dysfunctional. How is this a more viable alternative to happiness, considering they literally never changed the family I was born with?
Let's weigh this on likelihood. Some people are in abusive families, 50% of the world are below the average wealth. Obviously, it's far more likely that people are in worse situations on our side, but you can also access things like friends, like your hobbies. You can only access the money on your side. So that's the only path you guys have. We have multiple paths to victory that we can attain. You guys need to go on more than that. Next, so noting that explains there are lots of people in the world that cannot change, often the most vulnerable actors because they are the poorest by the definition of not being able to change. We should weigh them highly in this debate in that way. Next, arguments explain that this narrative is just often true, that money cannot buy happiness, and people are happier doing things like their hobbies, doing things like spending time with their family, spending their time with their friends. The first reason we say this is true is that you're biologically wired to crave things like social connection. The comparative is buying money, which maybe gets you some consumer good, which gives you a short-term dopamine boost. That is only short-term, and then you have to buy another one to be able to get that. Having things like a loving family gives you long-term happiness. It means it's ongoing for you. You get things like oxytocin and serotonin, which gives you happiness. They tell you that things like abusive, note that we just weigh that out pretty quickly, is not a harm for them. But often things like saying that you can find happiness in your friends and expecting that you're able to find happiness not through money means you're more likely to leave abusive relationships because you expect to find happiness in them, which means you're more likely to do things like fall out of them. Second reason is that just money is limitless. They tell you that there's some point to when people are able to get more happy from having that extra dollar on their side. Given you believe that, there are some people in the world that will not get extra happy, but believe that they should be able to get happy by making more money. That means that they are lying to them, and those people cannot. Note that things like when you get extra money, corporations increase the amount of goods you need to believe that you have to be happy. When you earn $50,000, they tell you, well, you need $60,000 of income to be happy to buy our goods. When you get $60,000, they tell you need $70,000. It keeps going up and up. There is more of a limit to family. Because if your family, you can get happiness through them. You can talk to your child and have hundreds of thousands of different conversations with them. You can do the same thing with them and get all that happiness. It's not limitless on our side. You can talk, so you do not believe that there is no endpoint that lies to them. The third reason is that you often do things like picking unfulfilling and just bad societal jobs. Instead of deciding to become things like a teacher, a childcare worker, or an environmental scientist, which are good for the world, incredibly fulfilling, you feel like you're making a difference in actual people's lives. I would suggest that lots of people would probably enjoy that. You trade it off for doing other things. On their side, maybe you do pick to work these jobs at their best case scenario, and then you also pick another job at the same time, which means you enjoy it far less because you're working 7 days of the week. That is a harm on their side. What we tell you is that people are far more fulfilled on our side by working jobs that make an actual difference in the world. There's also a broader societal impact, right? Because if people are doing more pro-social work, it means that we are able to get better benefits on that. Mass consumerism, which they support on their side, kills the environment. It means that the developing world is more likely to live in poverty, get more floods, get more heat waves that are hitting places like Serbia. Suggests that's really annoying. We should have less of that. Things like having working for evil companies are bad for people. On their side, you have things like telling your kids that they have to get into these jobs, they have to become a doctor to be happy. Your kids can probably be happy being a teacher. Why not let them? They would enjoy doing lots of that work. The fourth reason is that everything they point to ends up making relationships less meaningful. Maybe you do become super rich, but then you believe that your partner only married you because you were rich. Your friends only want to be around you because you're going to do things like pay for dinner. When you are less rich, you often think that these relationships are more meaningful on our side. You're scared that they'll leave. You're scared that your money will dissipate, that that will all go away, and you're less likely to believe your family's going to go away when they chose you because they thought they could be fulfilled through spending time with you on our side. And even when you do get to spend time with your family on their side, you're exhausted. You're angry from all those times spent in the cog of capitalism, working to try and get extra money. That is a harm on their side. The impacts of this are pretty clear. Firstly, it's wrong to lie to people principally. This team needs to prove that they're not lying. I suggest it's a harm. People lose agency when you tell them narratives that are a lie. And secondly, you keep working harder and harder and harder and never gets to the end point of happiness. That is harmful for people. These reasons, proud to oppose.
Ultimately, the narrative that money cannot buy happiness was a luxury that only very few were ever able to afford. Because we think it is principally wrong that this opposition stands up and tells people in the most dire of circumstances that the solution to their crushing poverty, that their solution to the stress caused by their financial woes is to simply look inside themselves and be a little bit more grateful for what they do have, they lose this debate. A couple of things in this speech. First, on the clash of whether or not this is true. Second, on individuals. Then on society. Finally, a new argument on how this narrative uniquely affects women. First question then. Do we think that this narrative is true? Clashing with their second argument. Broadly, we don't really think it matters to us whether or not this is true. We think if we prove that this narrative is socially harmful, we think we're still able to win this debate, whether or not they manage to prove that it's actually a reflection of the world as it stands. But look, even so, we tell you that money in fact does buy happiness, and we tell you that the examples that they bring us of having a nice meal with your family, of going to the park, often is a reflection of your financial circumstances. It's, are you able to afford to take your kids to that nice restaurant? Are you able to take that hour off work in the afternoon to take them to the park? But ultimately, what they also failed to engage with was Ellie's characterization to you of how in the absence of money, you not only cannot afford things that might make your life better, but you have extra financial woes heaped on you. So what they didn't deal with was the stress of not being able to pay your mortgage, of coming home every night and arguing with your partner over those financial woes, of not being able to pay the bills. That's something they have to defend on their side. So we think that this narrative is probably broadly incorrect. But having dealt with that, let's talk about the clash on individuals. Ellie tells you 4 things. First, that individuals lack motivation in their world when they do not have this belief that this will bring them eventual joy, that it will eventually pay off. Second, that this is particularly harmful to those from lower income backgrounds. This is a means of counteracting the social disadvantage, the circumstances that tells them that they'll never achieve anything. Third, that often you need to make trade-offs. And fourth, that it's just really incredibly demeaning if all of the people around you are telling you, when you are struggling from these financial woes, it doesn't matter, you just need to look inside yourself and be a little bit more thankful. How do they respond? we'll note that they only really engage with kind of one of these points on motivations. They never actually deal with our clashes on why it is so horrible to spend all this time with your wealthy friends being told, actually, you should just be more grateful. They never dealt with how this really impacts people on a day-to-day level. So we think on that impact alone, just on how this engages with people in their actual everyday lives, the reality of what this looks like on the ground, we're already winning this debate. But even so, they tell us that people already have a capitalist incentive to earn the bare minimum. Look, panel, even if this is true, this is literally the premise of what Ellie tells you in her argument, namely that people from lower income backgrounds in their world are encouraged to only earn the bare minimum. They're told you shouldn't aspire to anything more, that that's simply too hard, that it's simply unattainable, that you shouldn't bother, that it's not worth the financial sacrifice. We think in our world that it's much better that we do tell these people that they're capable of more, and that they ought to want more, that they ought to encourage themselves to attain more. So I think all they do is identify the problem with their argument. Let's clash this with their case then. They say that people are structurally unable to get money, and they matter dump about why it's hard to earn money in some circumstances. Look, we won't dispute that it's harder for some individuals than others to earn money. We don't think that's really relevant to this debate. Here's what you need to know: 2 things. First, they don't deal with the fact either that often you do have a degree of control over how much money you earn, or even if you don't, you have far less control over the things that they stand for as ways to get happiness on their side of the house. You don't control at all what kind of family you're born into, whereas by contrast, at least you have a degree of control in our world over what kind of job you want to earn in, over what kinds of choices you make. So comparatively, we don't think we make people feel hopeless, we think we make people feel like they have agency. But second, I want to contest their premise that the response of these individuals in these circumstances is hopelessness, because we don't think that's the case, okay? They simply assert that people from lower income backgrounds in our world are likely to feel hopeless, that they feel sad, that they think, I will never attain that money. But this, in fact, engages perfectly with Ellie's second argument, which they really failed to respond to properly, about how, in fact, the response is to say it is not fair that I, as a lower income individual, am locked out of happiness structurally by governments that fail to provide for me. We think when you tell people it is okay to aspire to more, it is okay to want that level of happiness, it is okay to see financial success as a prerequisite to happiness, people are far more likely in our world to challenge that. That is the basis of the argument that they totally fail to engage with. But look, let's clash this with their case on following your dreams and why it's better for people to go into socially useful professions like working. First, this doesn't deal with what Ellie tells you about why we think in our world these professions are paid much better, because there is now more pressure not to see nursing or teaching as vocational, rather more people are encouraged to go into it because it's seen as socially valuable, it's okay to want happiness, you're not expected to be altruistic to go into these professions. But even so, we're happy to take a hard line on this, to say that money is a prerequisite to happiness, that we would rather that people are not later in life tired, that they have their enjoyment sapped from these professions because of all the financial stress that we tell you about. So because in their world, individuals are crippled by financial distress because they are never given that empowerment to push for more, we think they're already losing this debate. But before I go on to my extension, sure.
Do you believe that being in poverty and low income is a choice for individuals?
No, but we also don't think that being born into awful family circumstances is a choice for individuals. But ultimately, we do think that one of the reasons why it is so hard for individuals to get themselves out of poverty is because there are narratives from people around them saying, you shouldn't try to aspire to more, you're never going to succeed. We think in our world, when you tell them you are only able to get happiness when you are aspiring to more, when you are pushing yourself to do the best you can, that is the point at which we at least make it a little bit easier. How then does this narrative uniquely affect women? Two reasons why this is the case. First, we think this is a narrative about the private and public spheres. So on our side, we are telling people you will be happier when you prioritize money, i.e. when you focus on the public sphere of your job. But on their side, they tell people you should prioritize the private sphere of your family, your home, your friends. We think any narrative that tells people that they ought to be prioritizing the private over the public, i.e. your family over your working life, will always hurt women more because it compounds with other narratives that tell women that it is their responsibility to prioritize the family life. So when you tell your parents you're getting a promotion that requires longer working hours, a man might be able to shrug them off when they say, money doesn't buy happiness, this is the wrong choice for you. But for a woman, that exacerbates other fears. The narratives of mum guilt, or of women being the primary caregivers, that means they're more likely to say, I shouldn't put my working life above the true happiness of my family, I ought to say no. Note that we think this is a unique tipping point for women's career decisions, because we think when you create a social narrative around something that is the source of happiness, what we think most people are aspiring striving for on an everyday, day-to-day level. That narrative is massively overpowering because you tell people this is the only way to get actual fulfillment. That is the point at which women make worse decisions for their jobs. But second, even if you don't buy that this narrative is a tipping point in general, it's specifically harmful because of the very specific conception and narrative it creates about what it means to be a woman who prioritizes money. In our world, you're simply someone who wants to be happy. That's not seen as shameful. But in their world, there's something wrong with you. You are perceived as too broken and emotionally cold to obtain happiness in the socially acceptable ways of family and friends, of taking your kids to the park and having a nice meal with your parents. So you're seen as someone who failed on that ground, who turned to financial success as a compromise. We think this is where we get the narratives of the nasty woman or selfish career woman. So think Theresa May being shamed for not having children, or the highly stereotyped figure of Miranda Priestley in The Devil Wears Prada. Because of this narrative, women who care about money are seen as selfish, they're seen as broken, they're seen as failures. What's the impact of this? We think they have to deal with this argument in their next speech, because we think this is a direct reason for many of the most harmful and pervasive stereotypes imposed on women. That to care about your career is selfish, that to aspire for something better is selfish. Because we think their narrative is disrespectful to people from lower income backgrounds, it's disrespectful to women, it inspires people never to push for anything better, we have never been prouder to propose.
The problem with Team England in this debate is that they want to have this debate exclusively on their terms, where your family cannot change, but your wealth can always change and is incredibly easy to be changed. They want us to have this debate in a vacuum where people do not care about what they can eat, who do not care about where they can go to school. They want to have this debate in a world where these narratives don't exist. Note that narratives have always existed. The reason why this narrative was produced, the reason why it exists, is because it is a pushback against capitalist narratives that told you should work as hard as you can and gain more and more money until you would never reach an end. There are advertisements all around us that tell us that we need things to make us happy, that we need physical goods to make us feel good about ourselves. This narrative told people that you could value your family, that you could value the things you had. Their narrative cut all of this people out. They never contend with this. They need to contend with the fact that people cannot always pull themselves up by their bootstraps, that people cannot always make change. Okay then, first on what they bring you about people living in poverty, second on benefits to individuals with their family, and third on society, and fourthly quickly on women. Okay, first then on people living in poverty, they tell you that the way this narrative manifests is that people are told to look inside themselves and be grateful for the things around them. We tell you this is not how this narrative manifests. The way that the narrative manifested in society was to tell people who were poor that they could not have ways to access happiness, that they had no sense of self-worth because the things that were supposed to bring them a good feeling and bring them things they needed in life was something they could never access. It was things like money. We tell you this is not so easy to change. We tell you that Team England wants these people to just pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Oftentimes, people couldn't pull themselves themselves up by their bootstraps. That was never going to be enough in this debate. They need to show you why these people changed. They never did. Their only response is to say that money doesn't buy happiness, so we shouldn't be telling people these things. Note that if that was true, then everyone in every single developing country would be depressed all the time. Money is not a precursor to happiness. It is not the precondition. It is just as wonderful to sit at the end of the day with your family and have a nice meal. That is where this debate occurs. This debate occurs when you're making a trade-off between going to work and working extra hours so now you can buy your new TV, and spending time with your family, going home, watching your kids' football game. It was not enough for them to try make this debate a tiny, tiny thing affecting very, very few people. We think people can't always pull themselves out by their bootstraps. These people on their side are so much worse. Society looks down on them. Okay then, secondly on individuals, their big push here is that your family is ascribed to you and it cannot change, so you cannot change your life. Obviously this is untrue, right? You can go out into the world, you can find someone to fall in love with, you can have a family and have kids. Your family is what you build for yourself. You do not aim for what you already have. You aim to make a future with your family. We tell you that brings you immense benefits. Their only response is in a POI to tell you that marriages are unhappy and people get separated. Guys, my parents are separated. That doesn't mean they do not wish they had me. That does not mean that the time we have spent together has not been wonderful and fulfilling and loving and amazing. The benefits that family can bring you are so deep. They stimulate things like your biological need to have people around you, your biological need to have people with you. Like our side meant that people could now sit at their deathbeds and be with their family. That was so much better. On their side, it did not matter if your meals cost $1 more. On our side, your family was there with you. That was a long-term benefit. That was what they never contend with. They needed to deal with these people who on our side now seek better families, who now try to spend time with those people. They build deeper connections. That was a bigger impact in this debate. The difference on their side was that though they would go to work more, they would not engage in these things. Yes.
As we've said from people, and it's easier for you to overcome disadvantages when we recognise the importance of money and the government is pressured to bring forward policies to remove them. On your side, governments can shirk their responsibilities because the responsibility for happiness lies with individuals.
Okay, I'm going to talk about policy later, but I think it's incredibly clear that if you are starving and you cannot get basic access to things, the government probably wants to deal with that. If they don't, they're a bad government. But I note that this obviously goes both ways with the kind of policies you trade off. A government is not going to perform every policy. On their side, perhaps there's something in that direction, but on our side, you are far more likely to have things like worker protections so that you didn't have to work an immense amount. You are far more likely to support people to be able to go home and spend time with their family. Of course, it's contingent on the kinds of things that were good for people. If we can prove that family was the ultimate benefit, which we do down the bench, then they cannot win on this. They cannot win on the fact that they get more money. We get people having better families. That policy was going to be better in that way. Okay then, next on society, on this idea of a false class consciousness, I already just gave you my response then. If people can't eat enough food and access basic rights, governments don't care, they're a bad government. But second, the comparative is worse. You're less likely to push for things like mandatory breaks and workers' rights. You're more likely to be pushed in poor conditions because society believed that it was capitalist and you were earning money and you were succeeding at your goal. On our side, when you valued things like family, which were implicit and made you feel very good and were deep to your sense of self and life, governments would prioritize this. On their side, they never had any way to prioritize those things. Okay then, next, the claim that they bring you is that jobs like nursing and teaching get paid a lot less. This is very bad for these people. I just want to point out how unintuitive this claim is. This is obviously not the reason why teachers and nurses are paid less. If that was true, it would also be a reason why doctors and lawyers are paid less, why fulfilling jobs are paid less. Note that on our side, people who are in these jobs, like nurses and teachers, are far better off. On their side, society actively looked down on them because they weren't fulfilling this capitalist role. They weren't earning more and more money. On our side, when these people were doing something out of fulfillment, people were far more likely to respect them, far more likely to pay them more because they were doing something for those reasons, because they were doing something for fulfillment. You were far more likely to look at these people better. They had immense emotional benefits because now they could pursue these jobs that made them incredibly, incredibly happy. On their side, they were never able to do that. It's incredibly clear at the end of that, the society gets better for so many reasons. Note that they also never contend with what we tell you about overconsumption. That on their side, because money was something that had no limit and family was something that was, you could reach a good place. On their side, when you kept wanting to get money and you kept wanting to get the things that money bring you, you are never satisfied. That leads to things like overconsumption. That leads to immense environmental damages. On our side, when you viewed things for the emotional benefit they could give you, when you focused on things like your family rather than accumulating needless amounts of wealth and spending more and more money on having a nicer house, on our side, clearly there was less of that overconsumption. You valued the incredibly good things in your life. Okay then, last thing, the thing they bring you quickly on women, yeah.
The nuance of our argument was not that people don't need money naturally, it's that sometimes there are situations where I make an irrational decision to think I don't need money. How does your case engage
Like, people need money in every case, right? I already told you from the beginning that the narrative exists because of capitalist incentives, because everywhere you look, like walk into the city of Serbia, and every wall there is an advertisement that tells you you need something, that tells you these things will make you happy. The reason why this narrative exists is so that people can rationalize their life choices, so that if people want to access things like family, they can actually do that on our side. They can feel happier without feeling like they're violating something that's inherent to life, without feeling like they're failing. That was clearly better. Okay then, I'm going to deal with what you're bringing, like, for 1 minute on women. First, like, they only tell you that these narratives tell women that they need to care about their family and go home. The first thing I'd say is that there were always incentives to love your kids, right? There were always incentives to have a personal connection. On their side, because these people aren't working, because they might want to stay at home, you actively look down on them because they're not producing money. That meant that mothers were far less valued in their world. On our world, people were far, like, looked at and seen as the benefit of what they were bringing, seen for the hard work that they were doing in bringing happiness to other people. But second, I just flip that, because on their side, if it's true that men are more affected by this narrative, then obviously on our side, that means they're far more likely to do things like help out in the home, to not do things like relegate the woman to being a housewife. Note that the change in the last few decades, driven by things like this narrative, is that men are far more likely to go to their child's soccer game. They are far more likely to not leave the woman to, like, have all these things. I note that that is something they never contend with. On our side, men were more likely to come home because they notice the important inherence of things like family and things like love and things like connection. Women, they tell you that women who care about money are now seen as selfish. Note that they're more, like, not seen as selfish. They are likely seen as pursuing a job that gives them fulfillment, rather than seen as, like, pursuing money for needless reasons. But if they wanted to pursue money, they still could on our side, because they could get benefits from it. Like, at the end of that, we were the ones who let people access things. On their side, people could not rationalize their life choices. They could not rationalize that they wanted to spend time with their family and have immense biological benefits. So incredibly proud to quote.
At the top of this speech, note that Australia have to defend the status quo. A status quo where, yes, advertisers every day tell me that I need more and more, where people are working for evil corporations. Capitalism exists on either side of the house. It was only on our side where you had to be remunerated for the jobs that you were probably going to do on either side, when you were more likely to gain a fulfillment from the jobs that necessity pushes you towards on either side. It was only on our side that people actually gained the chance of happiness and that we were able to level up nations and countries. Three things to talk about in this speech. Firstly, on women. Secondly, on who gets structural reform. And lastly, on who actually makes people happier. Firstly, on women, because they give a pretty scant response to what Maya tells you in second. Maya tells you that in our world, you are someone who wants happiness if you're a woman who's engaging in a job, if you're a woman who wants to ascend the corporate hierarchy. In their world, women who want happiness are demonized. Women who want money are demonized, and you're told that you shouldn't be doing that. They give a couple of quite irrelevant responses when they say that men are more likely to prioritize their family, they go and see their children's football games. That doesn't mean that on their side of the house, these narratives surrounding women have gone away, because there are still politicians who are women who are told that they shouldn't be wearing that expensive dress, that they shouldn't be trying to prioritize themselves over their family. And it's that locks women out of the workforce. This is really important because this affects half of the population. It affects their decision making, and it means that they are less likely to actually want to enter into these careers in the first place. If they wanted to actually level up people, if they wanted to take people away from the gender barriers that are stopping them from actually getting themselves out of poverty, they needed to deal with this argument far better than they did. Second thing to talk about then is structural inequality. Australia's big push here is that people cannot become wealthier because of a number of structural factors, and that it's bad to tell these people that they should be happy. I have three broad responses to this. Firstly, what they are doing is ossifying the status quo, a status quo where there are loads of structural inequalities that means people can't progress up the social hierarchy. Because on our side, when there is the narrative that money can buy you happiness, that's when you're more likely that you get political pressure. That's when you're more likely to get the lines on the bills that actually help people pull themselves out of poverty. And it has to be the narrative that money brings you happiness, because it can't just be that money brings you prestige. It can't just be that money brings you social advancement. And admittedly, on their side, you can still say that getting that job brings you prestige and connections. But it's far easier to say for politicians that not everyone deserves things like prestige, not everyone deserves things like connections, and they fall back on other narratives like the American dream and like meritocracy. But on our side, it's far more difficult to say that these people don't deserve happiness. It's literally like enshrined in the American Constitution that all people should have a right to happiness. So it's on our side of the house that you're more likely to build the railroads that combat the geographical disadvantages that they want to tell you about. It's more likely that you're going to get the redistributive policies to combat the economic and structural inequalities that mean people can't progress up the social hierarchy. It's only on our side that we actually solve the problems that they identify. But secondly, I think it's easier for some people to gain wealth than others through jobs, because for the rich and the privileged person, you can just quite naturally go into a high-paying job. You don't have to study to pass your accountancy exams because you're friends with the boss's son, and so you're likely to get happiness. You're likely to go into this high-paying job, but you're still likely to be able to spend a lot of time with your friends and family. So the opportunity cost they identify just doesn't exist for these people. The comparative is the people that we tell you about from first. It's the lower middle class or the working class people who actually really think about this narrative and whom this narrative predominantly affects when they are making the decision as to whether or not to take up a particular employment opportunity. They think, is it worth it to make such a big sacrifice to try and go into this job in the first place, or should I prioritize my family? Should I stay at home because this is probably something that seems more stable for me? On their side, I'm more likely to think that that risk isn't a risk that is worth taking. I'm less likely to go for that job promotion. I am more likely to stay at home with the family, especially with the counter-narrative that exists on their side. And that's when these jobs that are so inaccessible to people, that mean that people can't achieve wealth, just become the preserve of the elite even more on their side. But thirdly, even if this isn't the case, note it's incredibly demeaning to be told, as somebody who isn't able to access wealth, that you're actually fine. And I think the rhetoric that Alice uses in second when she said that you can sit and have a nice meal is the exact rhetoric that is used when people say, when politicians, when corporations are saying that you're actually fine, we actually don't need better welfare policies because you only need the basics to actually be happy. That's when there's the narrative that you actually need to pull yourself up by the bootstraps. That's when governments and corporations can abrogate all responsibility for actually solving structural inequality. What were our claims on inequality? Firstly, we told you that it's far easier for companies to underpay me. It's far harder to push for things like improving socioeconomic inequalities. They say that you're more likely to overwork your workers because they say, I'll pay you money. A couple of responses. Firstly, a lot of people have to be overworked and have to take those extra shifts. It's far better for these people if they feel that there's a sense of hope, that there's a goal, that they're actually doing something for a purpose and that there's happiness at the end of the tunnel. But secondly, I think otherwise I can probably work it out for myself. If I am one of the very privileged people they talk about, people we shouldn't really care about compared to the people we tell you about, then I'm probably able to recognize when I do have lots and lots of money and I myself am not feeling happy, that I probably should just give up my job as a corporate lawyer and go and become a teacher. And a lot of people do this, seeming to suggest that people can work this out for themselves. Secondly, we tell you that jobs with a social value become underpaid. They say that people look down on these jobs and actually pay them more. But look, governments don't want to pay their nurses and their doctors and their teachers more. They can weaponize this narrative to say that they're doing it for the love of it, that they've gone into it not because they want money, but because they want fulfillment, and that's when they don't pay them more. The strategic implication of this is it deals also with their analysis of exploitative employers. The last thing we tell you is that this encourages good forms of aid and charity. You're more likely to give money to other people and donate because you believe that your money can bring them happiness, and that's far better than anything they got on their side of the house. Before I move on to talking about happiness, yes?
If the narrative is that you find happiness through hobbies like learning or having a healthy family, why would we defund social services like education and healthcare?
We are more likely to get people going into these services when they are more likely to be better paid, and that's when you're more likely to get these services far better subsidized, far better remunerated. Secondly, on who actually gets happiness, because they essentially say that money is limitless and then people are sucked into cycles of overconsumption and working for evil corporations. A couple of responses here. Firstly, have we stopped advertising under the status quo? No. Companies are always going to try and exploit this narrative. And instead of things like, well, buy this because it will make you happy, they're likely to say, well, buy this makeup because it will make you look good in front of men, or buy this because it will give you a lot of prestige. We would far rather the narrative that buying things actually makes you happy. And this is because being happy is something that is falsifiable, because I know whether or not I am happy. And yes, this does exist to a degree with other things, but this is far safer than these other things which are socially constructed, such as prestige or such as whether you look good in the eyes of others. But second thing they say then is picking bad jobs. Look, I think it's really bad if you force people to go into the dream careers that they talk about rather than going into corporations where you're more likely to make money. And that's because you often need some amount of money, because often what makes me happy changes over time. But money is the prerequisite to ensuring that future me can feel happy. When I have money from my corporate job in the bank, that's when I can retrain to be a teacher if that's what actually makes me happy. So we facilitate the opportunities that can make you happy. On family, note also when they say that family is something you construct, you're able to actually construct a better family when you take that job promotion in another country and you're able to actually connect with people you like. Again, the thing that's holding you back from doing that on this side of the house is the belief that it's too risky, that it's not worth it, because the only thing you're getting from it is money, and that money doesn't correlate from happiness. And note on working for evil corporations, it's probably far better that people do that on our side. It's probably far better that people are enabled to fulfill happiness, because it was a prerequisite to achieve any sort of happiness, and it was something that leveled up nations only on our side of the house.
I think it was unstrategic for this proposition team to say that this narrative made the poorest of the poor stop working to try and earn money to survive or to improve the lives of their families. It wasn't about these extreme cases where incentives to survive and afford basic necessities obviously existed on the both sides of the house. It was, however, about pushing back against the capitalist lie that told workers that your value was ascribed to the things that you consumed, the income that you earned and bought to propagate the cogs of the machine. The human soul, we think that the human soul transcended the green bits of paper that they want to ascribe human value to. We think that money was just not enough. We told you several things that they just did not respond to. Firstly, we told you that we are biologically wired to care about human relationships. That is why on someone's deathbed, they care more about their family being around them rather than how much money they have in their bank account. Secondly, we told you that money is limitless. You can never be satisfied with how much you have. We told you that you obviously compare how much money you have with someone that is far, far wealthier than you. But the family you had could not be compared. The family you had was just precious and so special to you because you could never ever replace them. I'm going to do 4 things in this speech. First, I'm going to do some characterization of what this narrative actually looks like. Secondly, I'm going to do on people who couldn't change with this narrative. Thirdly, on the people who could change, and lastly about inequality and women. Firstly, what does this narrative that money can buy you, that money cannot buy you happiness actually look like? Firstly, it existed in an incredibly capitalist context where money was how people afforded things like rent, basic necessities, and ensured a basic standard of life. Obviously, the desire to survive and escape poverty and afford basic necessities and work within this capitalist structure existed on both sides of the house, along with the capitalist structures that facilitated it, right? But secondly, this narrative pushed back against the materialist and capitalist culture that pervaded the societies, that pervaded people's mindsets. So, what the implication of this was that people did not become unmotivated under our side. People didn't just stop working hard. Poor people in the status quo weren't poor because they thought that money was not everything. Obviously, the capitalist incentives existed on both sides. They needed to be comparative there. So that is a huge strategic flaw for the case. It takes out their claims about motivation. It takes out their claims about poor people not advancing the social mobility. But firstly, on the people who couldn't change the material circumstances, because I think that this team makes a grave error when they state their case and they claim that individuals can actually change their material circumstances and thus be happy when they get more money. But we told you that this was incredibly factually dishonest. Why was this? Some people could not change their material circumstances significantly in Proposition's world. In the absence of a narrative that told them that money was not tied to their happiness, they felt that they were being deprived of their happiness. They felt that they threw themselves into the Sisyphean endeavor of work. They questioned their self-worth. They became cogs in a machine. We told you that there were a series of uncontrollable factors that meant you couldn't rise up. What did they tell you? Firstly, they said that, some people can have control. Why is this the case, guys? Obviously, the most disadvantaged people you want to claim on your side could not change the material circumstances. In the status quo, they were told to move up the ladder. They were told to work harder. They were told to get on the grind set and make more money. But this didn't stop their bosses from exploiting them. This didn't stop them from being discriminated and locked out of jobs because of their race, because of their gender. We told you, their response never got other mechanism. The structural reason that stopped people from going up in the social chain wasn't because of this narrative. It was because of the structural reasons we told you I would never respond to. Secondly, they said that the second response, no thank you, is that even if some people could pull themselves up by the bootstraps, firstly, we thought that obviously they compared themselves to other people. That's to say, maybe you could materially get a bit wealthier, but this still makes you happy because you're always relatively poorer than someone else. That was why you could never get happiness. But secondly, we thought that the corporations had huge bad incentives to set the requisite bar for how much money you needed to be happy, such as incredibly high, right? Because they wanted you to keep coming back and buy their stuff, because they wanted you to spend as much money as possible, which meant that you wouldn't be happy with a Honda Civic. You would only be happy with a BMW or Mercedes. So this bar to happiness was incredibly high because of the corporate incentive for you to spend as much money as possible. No, thank you. Okay, so at the end of this, you should believe that there were many people in this debate who couldn't change their material circumstances significantly. These people felt incredibly bad because of this narrative. They felt as if they were being deprived of happiness. They felt as if other people who were wealthier than them were accessing happiness, and they felt incredibly bad. That was a huge stakeholder. If you believe that even some people could not change the material circumstances, we clearly win this debate. But secondly, engaging in their best case where people could maybe change their circumstances. They firstly said that, other sources of happiness other sources of happiness like family are ascribed to you and you cannot control them. For example, abusive families. Firstly, the counterfactual narrative in our world says that you should derive happiness from families, not put up with abuse from your families. So if your family is abusive and doesn't give you happiness, that is an incentive why under our world you escape that abusive family and you gain happiness from other sources. But secondly, as Will pointed out in a POI response, we told you that our counterfactual wasn't just finding happiness in families alone. It was finding happiness in literally everything else other than money, which is a far greater choice that these people had, rather than the singular focus of money that you guys had to defend, right? So we thought that, if your family was abusive, you could turn to friends, you could turn to other sources of support. We thought that obviously the choices were far greater under our side. Then they said that, it was demeaning for poor people to be told that, economic empowerment was not the issue. But we flipped this, right? Because their side demeaned poor people when they said that the only way for you to be happy was to just work harder. If you weren't happy, it just meant that you weren't working enough. Poor people could also lead deep and fulfilling interior lives. They weren't just connected to the economic systems that control them. They could also have find happiness in their families, in their friends. It was incredibly demeaning for this team to say that poor people could only find happiness through their economic output. It was just incredibly factually dishonest to say that poor people could not access happiness through their families, and we should not be telling them that. So at the end of this, we told you that the Hail Mary to say that money is a prerequisite to happiness because if you don't have money, you can't do things like afford nice things for your family, etc. Firstly, obviously, as I framed in my introduction, this prerequisite is relatively met under both sides of the house because of the capitalist incentives. But secondly, we actually they never responded to our material that money corrupts families and other sources of happiness in many contexts. That's to say, that is why the reason why spouses argued over things like money was because they thought money was what they derived happiness from. The reason why people after they came back from work were likely to lash out and start conflicts was because they were so tired and exhausted from going out to earn money. That was the reason why money corrupted these other forms of happiness. Even if it was some prerequisite, we satisfied that prerequisite sufficiently, and even if we didn't, we thought that obviously people could lead fulfilling lives even if they weren't as wealthy as they wanted them to be. In fact, in many cases we flipped this. Money actively corrupted the other sources of happiness. These sources of happiness were not available to these people. Before I go on, I'll take a POI.
If we biologically crave and need social connection, haven't you just narrowed your own case? Because presumably that
No, those biological desires are stamped out and eroded by the capitalist system. It tells us that we should prioritize economic empowerment and income and money and consumerism over our desires to meet new people, to expand our social circle. In the capitalist circle, we are becoming increasingly isolated. We are becoming increasingly atomized. We lack friends. We lack family. That is the world you have to defend. We cared about those relational things. We cared and we won clearly on that. But lastly, on their only win part about inequality in women, because they say that it's easier for companies to underpay you, because if money is seen as unimportant, then happiness can be, distributed somewhere else. Firstly, these companies would obviously overwork you, because at the point at which you cared about money so much and you thought that was the source of your happiness, these companies held all the leverage. They could literally make you work 14 hours a day. But also, this had profound implications to the point, right? Because if they could overwork you and there was an oversupply of labor because everyone thought money was the source of happiness, then they could afford you to pay low, right? Increase supply, obviously the price of labor went down. But the last point was about government services, right? Firstly, obviously if the source of happiness was not money and the source of happiness was things like education and the source of happiness was things like healthcare, obviously that gave the government a huge reason to fund those sorts of things, right? Fund hospitals because that was the source of happiness, or fund education for those reasons. But obviously this was not true. In the status quo, people obviously the government didn't defund welfare because people thought the money wasn't everything. Obviously this team needed to live in the real world. For those reasons, incredibly proud to oppose.
Wonderful. We thank the opposition speaker for the remarks, and that's the end of the substantive part of the debate. The reply portion, upper level first. Here.
England's problem in this debate has been that they've failed to give any response on the family that you get, the benefits that you are able to get. We bring you from first the things that they cannot buy you, that money cannot give you. We tell you that money is limitless and family is not, that you can find a place where you feel happy and you feel good. They are never able to deal with this. They are never able to deal with these people who can no longer rationalize their life choices, who can no longer seek out a family, who can no longer develop these skills and go into places that make them feel incredibly happy. They're never able to deal with these people. On our side, we gave people the benefits that they could never get. Perhaps they gave people more money. That was limitless. That could never end. That was never something that you would feel satisfied in achieving. First, I'm going to talk about whether there's a trade-off. Second, people at disadvantage. And third, policy and people like women. Okay, first on whether there's a trade-off. We've highlighted down the bench that the trade-off is that capitalist incentives tell you that you have to accept more time and more work so that you can gain more money and buy the lovely shiny things that advertisements tell you should. We tell you that this then occurs at a crossroads. It's like what they bring you at third, where you're choosing between that job that will cost you time. That means you can no longer spend time with your family. It means that on our side, you're more likely to consider your choices. You can now rationalize to yourself and normalize to yourself that you are making making a choice for a good reason. Note that on their side, there were always incentives to pick that job. The difference is that on our side, when you wanted to pursue things like family, which would bring you incredible biological sense of importance, you could be able to rationalize your opinion, you could be able to develop these things. We told you that money was never able to give you these things, and they never give you a single response to the beautiful things that money cannot buy. They try to get over this in a POI response. They tell you that biological incentives occur on our side anyway. The difference is that on their side, the incentive was always to work harder. It was always to trade off the love that you could give your family on our side. Note that then on people in disadvantage, I think it was incredibly silly for England to tell you that the reason people remained in advantage was because people told them that they should be happy with what they have. I'd say that in the majority of cases, people wanted to get out of this disadvantage. There were so many reasons they would want to. You want to eat better food. You want to be able to have a more stable life. But there are so many reasons why you are not able to do this. Perhaps you are born into disadvantage. Perhaps you are born into places where you cannot get out of this. The impacts on these people were huge. It was an extreme and a crushing sense of hopelessness, that not only could you never access the happiness that other people could through money, but that you could never achieve happiness in your own life, that you were failing at what society was, that you were failing to get to the places where you needed to be. On our side, you were far more likely to be able to appreciate the things in your life, to feel happy and feel like you had a sense of self-worth. On their side, they traded this off for these people. This was the most important impact in this debate. But then for people who weren't disadvantaged, the difference in this debate was on their side, they would never try to pursue things like family. They would never try to pursue these things. On our side, we told you we were better for so many reasons, that there was a limit to family, that you could be satisfied with what you have, that family was not something you would worry would go away. On their side, you would. But we told you that it was just stimulating your nerves. It was stimulating your sense of biological importance, to be around beautiful people who love you, to have people at your deathbed. They needed to contend with these people. They needed to contend with that on their side, these people are seen as weaker and less worthy. On our side, they were able to develop these connections with other people. On their side, they weren't. Lastly, on women and policy, they tell you that women are shamed for working. We tell you that the opposite happens, that in the status quo, in their world, if people want to be mothers and they want to pursue other things, they're necessarily looked down on by society. These people are now seen as worthless because they're not pursuing that narrative. But then we tell you, moreover, that on our side, also, you have things like societal change, because men are now encouraged to see things like family being important. They're far more likely to leave that role to women. Note that the structural disadvantage that occurs throughout society is that women are locked into those roles. On our side, they're not. On our side, they're far more likely to pursue these things in the first place. Because we were able to give these things people things like family, because we were able to give you an incredibly deep sense of self-worth, they cut these people out from this. They were never able to let people rationalize their decisions and be happy in their lives. They cut people out from this. So incredibly proud to oppose.
Australia's problem in this debate is that they just don't seem to know what they actually think. Like, at the end of this debate, I'm genuinely confused about what they think the narrative looks like, what they think the world looks like, or indeed what they actually stand for on their side. Because on the one hand, they say that we have to stand for a capitalist hellscape in which no one does anything except work. But then they say that this is the status quo because, hey guys, just go outside and look at the Serbian billboards. On the one hand, they try to say that people don't see their relatives on their deathbed in our world. But then when responding to my argument on women, they say, hey guys, obviously you love your kids on either side because there are biological urges. At the end of this debate, I've got no idea what their case actually is. We think it's clear that our material stands firm. Two questions to ask when adjudicating this debate. First on capitalism, second on the family. First on capitalism. They say that this plays to harmful capitalistic narrative that you ought to just work and work and work. You should pick the job you hate. You should take on extra shifts because of capitalism, because the only way to be happy is money. But they weren't listening to what we told you in first and second, again and again in third. First of all, that this isn't necessarily true. We don't have to stand behind the only source of happiness in your life being like capitalism. Like, you can obviously still have a family on our side of the house. You can still have other things. Indeed, a capitalistic incentive to make money is often very helpful in alleviating financial stress, in meaning that you can access these other things that will also bring you fulfillment. But also, we pointed out throughout all of our speeches that their world is also capitalistic and selfish by their own narrative, because go and look at the Serbian billboards, guys. Here's the actual deadlock breaker. Their world says that your dream career is a reward in and of itself. You should want to work in a badly paid job because it's so fulfilling and it gives you family time. But in our world, for those who do have control over their circumstances, for the girl Ellie told you about in the first minute of our first speech, the smart kid from the disadvantaged background who needs to decide if going to university is worth it or not, she makes the right choice in our world. Because against everyone, all of the voices telling her she can't do it, she knows this is what will bring her happiness. But they say, then and again, most people don't have control over their circumstances. We were very charitable. We dealt with this group too. We said, in the absence of a coercive narrative that work is its own reward, we get a greater social push for more levelling up. And this wasn't about alleviation of the worst forms of poverty. This was about empowering people to seek more than the bare minimum, for ask for redistribution, to ask for levelling up. But look, panel, say you don't buy any of this. Say that Australia have just confused you too much. Say that you buy their negative case, that governments won't do anything, nobody controls their own circumstances or job. Note the crucial argument that we brought you from first, that even if nobody has control, even if the whole debate is a wash, at least the narrative isn't, you should be happier, you should be more grateful, you should look for happiness in your own family and your own life. We don't care that your marriage is falling apart because you are arguing over bills every night. You should just watch television together and then it will all be okay. We win because we don't expose the most vulnerable to this damaging, to this condescending advice that says that the solution to dire poverty is to just be an optimist, to think your way out of it. We think for that reason, both the people who do have control and those who don't are far better off in our world. For those who do have control, that's financially. For those who don't, that's mentally. But second, on family, I just think that their case here is frankly irrelevant because they knife it themselves in second when they say in response to our argument on women, but you obviously love your children either way. Obviously, there are natural biological instincts to love and care for these people who love you so much. So we think that their claim here is just pretty irrelevant. But also, this fails to engage with the crux of what we brought you consistently throughout our case, about how people are far more able to have families in our world, about how it's so much better for your family when you're not constantly under financial stress because you feel like you can seek that capitalistic incentive. But also note our argument on women that we think we got pretty scant response to. The only engagement is, at least we achieve empowerment for women who can be mothers. But panel, that's literally the narrative we said that we're opposing, that the only valid choice for women is to be a mother. So because in our world, we think we get better treatment for women, we get better treatment for lower income individuals, because people aren't told that they should simply be more grateful and think themselves out of the most dire circumstances, we win this debate.